The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Scoring horns in bass clef can be helpful to the player, as long as the orchestrator remembers to use new notation, avoid ledger lines above the bass staff, doubly proofread horn parts if the score is in concert pitch, and remember that players easily read ledger lines below the treble staff down to E and even D. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. In a recent video, I addressed the issue of low exposed horn notes. Also in my second book, 100 More Orchestration Tips, I have an entire extended chapter about the low range of the horn. But despite these resources, I'm still seeing a general need for clear, concise guidance about when and why to use bass clef and horn scoring. So here's a short list of do's and don'ts to help you apply the bass clef with confidence to your horn parts. Number 1. Always use bass clef new notation and avoid old notation. Old notation is a holdover from the natural horn days, when low open harmonics were written in bass clef an octave lower compared to the rest of the instrument's range in treble clef. Originally, these were a very limited set of pitches, usually the second and third partials, always written as C2 and G2. Once the modern horn was developed, becoming chromatic throughout its entire range, composers held on to this practice of scoring low pitches in bass clef, and since horns were in F, that meant that treble clef pitches sounded down a perfect fifth, but bass clef pitches would sound up a perfect fourth. This is what we now call old notation, and it definitely has its drawbacks. Pitches don't flow logically between treble and bass clef, but always drop down or jump up an octave. What's worse, the horn's low register in old notation can result in a huge amount of ledger lines, all the way down to a written D1. While horn players can and do certainly learn to cope with such parts, the writing is unnecessarily cluttered, requiring a great deal more effort to absorb while sight reading. This situation lasted well into the 1930s and 40s, until both horn players and composers rebelled, and the new notation system was instituted, in which all pitches, in both clefs, sound down a perfect fifth. This has the benefit of consistency for phrases that flow between staves as being far easier to read and comprehend, vastly reducing the amount of ledger lines for low horn scoring. Number 2. Don't use bass clef just to differentiate between high and low horns. In my recent video lecture on O Fortuna from Carmina Burana, I illustrated the ridiculousness of how Carl Orff's old notation scoring of his lower horns relates in written pitches to the high horns, compared to the convenience of new notation, or even just leaving passages in treble clef. The ultimate moment of absurdity is achieved at the end of the song, when both upper and lower horns are playing the unison-sounding pitch of D4, written as A4 in treble clef and A3 in old notation bass clef. All questions of old notation aside, Orff is committing the venial sin of scoring low horns in bass clef just to point out that they're low compared to the high horns above, when it would be easier for all concerned just to leave the entire part in treble clef, except for some of the lowest pitches. So if you must split up your horns into upper and lower parts on different staves, then at least don't use bass clef this way. Number 3. Don't assume that you have to use bass clef just because of a few low ledger lines. Horn players often play a mid to lower range role in orchestral music, and as a reflection of this, many of their parts feature passages written in ledger lines below the treble staff. So your average section player easily reads down to low E with no problem. Some players look at a written D3 as a kind of gateway, where the stack of ledger lines gets a bit harder to read. Therefore, switching to new notation bass clef is preferable. Still, in some horn etudes, you'll see scoring in which the player pops out the occasional low C in ledger lines amongst higher pitches. Probably the best guides are general weight of the part and density of information. If the part wanders below middle C from time to time, occasionally down to written E3 or D3, then you can probably just leave it in treble clef. If, however, the center of gravity for the part really sits around D3 and lower, then bass staff makes things much more readable. Likewise, if the part has a certain degree of complexity, with tricky rhythms and/or frequent jumping around between lower pitches, it's much easier on your horn player when written in bass clef, even if most of the music is above D3 or even E3. All the same. Number 4. Avoid ledger line pitches above the staff in bass clef scoring. Sometimes you'll see pitches as high as D4 or E4 above the staff in horn etudes. This is not necessarily to establish these pitches as a norm, but rather to make sure the student will have no problem in reading them in some modern scores. But the truth is that it's enormously easier for a horn player just to read these pitches in treble clef, and jump over to bass clef in the middle of a phrase as we saw before. As occasionally fiddly as reading low old notation pitches may be for your average section player, throwing high ledger lines at them above the new notation bass staff is a conceptual minefield that's certain to cause frustration and extreme annoyance. Be smart, and keep such pitches in treble clef where they belong. Which just brings us to the last, and in some ways most important concern in this day and age. Number 5. Doubly proofread any horn parts originally scored in concert pitch. This is a problem that happens over and over again for developing composers, especially in music school reading sessions. The composer will write the full score in concert pitch with their notation app, with their horns mostly in bass clef. Then, when automatically extracting the parts transposed to F, they'll leave all those bass clefs in the part, resulting in sky-high ledger lines for the poor horn players to cope with. At best, this will result in raised hands during the reading, wasting precious time for everyone there. At worst, the players simply won't play the parts at all, or they'll fumble through them with perhaps a lot of missed notes. You can see this as an extension of the previous advice to avoid ledger lines above the staff, but on steroids, because not only are such pitches far out of the reckoning of horn players, but also something that would have been so easy to fix for the composer if they just proofread their parts better. So do everyone a favor and double-check any of your concert pitch scored horn parts with extra attention to this problem when bass clef is used. A couple last things to think about. Remember how it took all the way until the 1930s or 40s before new notation started to take over? For you as an orchestrator, learning your craft mostly from public domain scores on IMSLP, Dover editions, YouTube videos, and maybe the public library or occasional old pocket score, most of the bass clef horn parts you'll run across are in old notation. So even though we don't use this approach anymore, and you should avoid it at all costs in your own horn parts, you should still learn to read and instantly recognize old notation pitches. Especially if you read a lot of Strauss, Mahler, and other big blasting scores from that amazing late Romantic to post-Romantic period. The other thing to remember is just how rarely you'll ever need to use bass clef, even with a lot of lower mid-range pitches. Keep in mind that our gateway pitch of written D3 is sounding G2 for horns in F. From there, the instrument at best has only about another octave of usable range, with a rather gravelly sound compared to the leaner, cleaner trombones in that range, not to mention the beautifully smooth and resonant tuba. All the same, it's a wonderfully effective range for a certain kind of menacing mood, and as I showed in my tip on exposed low horn pitches, a very soft pedal can be achieved that beautifully underpins a harmony when scored the right way. So logistically speaking, if your horn's sounding pitches don't go any lower than a concert G2 or A2, then you might not need bass clef at all. So use this checklist of do's or don'ts where applicable, and whatever you do, don't use alto clef in your concert pitch horn scoring. See you soon.